It began not with bombs or tanks, but with whispers, data packets slipping unseen through cables beneath the Atlantic. In the late 2030s, after years of political deadlock, protests, and economic strain, America's soul had already started to fracture. Russia, observing quietly from across the Arctic, saw an opening. They didn't need to invade the United States. They just had to make Americans distrust each other enough to finish the job themselves. Through artificial accounts, deep-faked news, and clever manipulation of local grievances, Moscow's strategists began mapping the cultural arteries of the U.S. Every city, every ideological divide, every resentment. Algorithms predicted which regions would crack first: the industrial Midwest, drowning in job loss; the conservative South, convinced that Washington had abandoned them; and the progressive West Coast, dreaming of independence. Within a few years, Russian influence had become invisible background noise, steering millions of social conversations without a single identifiable source. Small events were magnified. An argument in a school board meeting became a viral flashpoint. A state election dispute was turned into proof of tyranny. People no longer saw a flag to unite under. They saw enemies wearing the same colors. The president called for calm, but his voice reached no one. Every broadcast was met with suspicion. Governors began holding private security meetings. States quietly formed economic pacts, bypassing federal oversight. Washington dismissed it as political theater. It wasn't. The Union's seams were already tearing. Not with violence yet, but with silence. The kind that comes before storms. By 2042, the first states voted on regional sovereignty, claiming it was temporary, just administrative. But once those laws passed, they never looked back. Russian advisors celebrated privately. America, they believed, was finally devouring itself from within.
It didn't begin with a war. It began with doubt. No missiles, no soldiers, no loud declarations of conquest. Just quiet seeds of confusion dropped into the soil of an already divided America. By the mid-2030s, the United States was still powerful on paper, but internally, it was exhausted. Every election was a war of identity. Every headline a spark that set half the country on fire. People no longer trusted the news, the government, or each other. That's when Russia saw its chance. Not to destroy America from the outside, but to make it fall from within. It began with subtle data infiltration, millions of fake profiles that didn't shout propaganda, but whispered believable doubts. They targeted small-town forums, religious groups, online schools, and even local news pages. Each message was crafted with precision. Make the South feel betrayed by the coasts. Make the West believe the East was stealing their freedom. Make the Midwest believe no one heard their pain. Within 5 years, these messages had grown roots deep into the American psyche. By 2038, entire communities were living inside alternate realities, each convinced the others were enemies. Moscow didn't need to create chaos. They just needed to amplify what already existed. Using artificial intelligence networks, Russia's digital agents monitored America's social climate in real time, releasing carefully timed leaks, fake scandals, and AI-generated evidence that made truth impossible to recognize. Conspiracy theories became mainstream. Militias reappeared, and politicians began speaking openly about regional self-defense. America's enemies didn't hack its weapons. They hacked its story. By 2040, governors of several southern states proposed a Union of Liberty, promising to protect traditional values and state rights. At first, Washington ignored it. But when California and Oregon formed their own Pacific Alliance, everything changed. The East Coast, built on finance and federal loyalty, held on tightly to Washington, D.C., while the South and West turned inward. Trade disputes erupted. States began rejecting federal laws, printing their own currency systems disguised as digital credits. The dollar collapsed slowly, like a tower eaten from the inside. Russia's strategy wasn't about military dominance. It was psychological warfare at the deepest level. Every American argument online became another bullet fired in an invisible war. And the world watched, too afraid to intervene. In 2043, when Texas formally declared the Southern Federation, 10 years had passed since the split, but the scars still glowed beneath the surface. The maps were different now. 3 distinct nations where one superpower once stood. The Southern Federation, led from Houston, embraced a fiery nationalism mixed with religion and oil wealth. Its leaders promised strength, tradition, and purity, but their cities grew restless under strict social controls and widening inequality. Across the continent, the Pacific states glittered like a futuristic dream, a network of smart cities powered by artificial intelligence, ruled less by politicians and more by algorithms designed to optimize human behavior. People there lived longer, healthier lives, but freedom came with invisible strings. Everything was recorded, analyzed, predicted. And then there was the Federal Republic of the Northeast, the last remnant of the old America, still waving the stars and stripes, still believing they were the true heirs of the Founding Fathers, even as their influence faded. Washington, D.C. was now a fortress of bureaucracy, surrounded by distrust. Each government claimed to represent real Americans, but the truth was simpler. The experiment had ended. The United States existed only in textbooks and old documentaries. Russia watched from afar, patient as ever. Their original plan had succeeded beyond expectation, yet they knew victory was temporary. Power, like nature, abhors a vacuum. New alliances were forming quickly. The Southern Federation deepened ties with Russia, exchanging oil for weapons and technology. The Pacific states turned to Asia, partnering with Japan, South Korea, and a rising India. The Federal Republic clung to Europe and Canada, hoping to rebuild something like NATO, though everyone quietly called it the Old Man's Club. Economically, the continent was a puzzle of competing currencies and digital systems. The Southern credit was backed by energy, the Pacific coin by AI-driven productivity, and the federal dollar by fading trust. Trade between the three was possible, but fragile. Each transaction a reminder of the past they had shattered. Families were divided not just by politics, but by new borders guarded by drones and data firewalls. Cross-border marriages became illegal in some regions. Children learned different histories. A kid in Los Angeles grew up believing the split saved democracy. A kid in New York was taught it destroyed it. Truth had become regional property. Yet under all the propaganda, something unexpected began to stir. The younger generation, who had never known a united America, in 2055, a decade after the split, a summit was secretly held in neutral territory. Some said it was Iceland, others whispered it happened in Alaska, where the old borders still blurred. Representatives from all 3 nations met not as enemies, but as people exhausted by isolation. They didn't sign treaties or exchange promises. They just talked, quietly, for 3 days. No cameras, no propaganda. When they returned, none spoke publicly about what was said, but small changes began to ripple. Trade restrictions eased. Student exchange programs reopened. The old American anthem, long banned in two of the republics, began to reappear in underground music. And for the first time in 20 years, the satellites that once monitored each other's territories began sharing data again. To predict climate disasters, not missile strikes. Russia's analysts noticed this shift too late. Their greatest psychological weapon, the one that made a nation doubt its own reflection, was beginning to lose power. Because even reflections, once broken, can be pieced together by those who remember what they once looked like. The Kremlin tried to restart its information campaigns, but the algorithms that once divided the world now refused to obey. They had learned too much from the chaos they created. Somewhere in the ruins of what used to be the United States, a new identity was forming. Not quite a country yet, but an idea strong.
By 2056, the word Reuniter had spread beyond the underground. It began with whispers on encrypted networks, but soon appeared sprayed on walls, printed on shirts, murmured in classrooms. The movement had no flag, no single leader, only an idea, that the experiment of freedom wasn't meant to die behind digital borders. In the Pacific states, young engineers smuggled code that disabled surveillance drones for exactly 60 seconds, long enough for messages to pass hand to hand. In the Southern Federation, preachers quoted verses about forgiveness and quietly mentioned the Reuniters' name in their sermons. Even in the Federal Republic's universities, once bastions of cynicism, students staged memory vigils, projecting old footage of parades and speeches from the United States that had once united them all. Governments tried to erase these sparks, but suppression only fanned the flame. Russia watched the phenomenon with growing unease. What they'd spent 2 decades crafting, the perfect social fracture, was beginning to heal itself. Kremlin analysts ran simulations and couldn't explain the trend. No propaganda could reverse it. The human desire to connect had outgrown the algorithms that once divided it. In secret, Moscow's cyber division proposed Operation Mirrortorm, a plan to rewrite digital history itself. Using advanced AI seeded across old American networks, they would flood the Reuniter channels with fabricated memories, twisting nostalgia into confusion. The plan's brilliance lay in its subtlety, make people doubt not just the government, but their own past. If they no longer knew what the real America had been, they would stop trying to rebuild it. Within months, the digital skies darkened. Thousands of conflicting videos appeared, some showing the old U.S. committing atrocities that never happened, others claiming the split was heroic liberation. The truth became a blur once more. But this time, something was different. The Reuniters didn't fight misinformation with facts, they fought it with presence. They organized real-world gatherings, not protests, but quiet circles where people simply talked, face to face, no screens allowed. For the first time in years, truth was rebuilt not online, but in human memory. The year 2060 arrived with silence. The borders remained, but the guns along them were quiet. Delegates from the Pacific, Southern, and Federal Republics gathered in Denver, neutral ground, where the old flag once flew over mountain winds. There was no anthem, no grand ceremony, only exhausted leaders facing the ghosts of their own citizens. The Reuniters had forced them to the table, not through war, but through truth. Over 12 nights, they drafted what historians would later call the Denver Accord. It didn't restore the old United States, it created something new, the North American Federation, a loose alliance built on transparency and shared governance. Each region kept its autonomy, but citizens could move freely, trade openly, and vote in a joint council that spanned the continent. The announcement shook the world. Russia tried one last move, an EMP strike disguised as a satellite failure, but it backfired. The blackout that followed only strengthened human connections. People met under candlelight, telling stories of resilience. When the power returned 3 days later, the Federation was already real in people's minds. Moscow's information empire collapsed under global outrage. Sanctions turned inward, and within years, the Kremlin's own citizens demanded reform. The age of manipulation had burned itself out. In the reborn Americas, children studied the era of division not as tragedy, but as warning. Memorials stood where borders once cut families apart. And somewhere in the high desert of Nevada, a monument rose. 3 hands carved from stone, one from each former nation, reaching toward a single point of light. The inscription was simple: we remembered. Decades later, historians would say Russia's greatest mistake was believing unity could be permanently destroyed, but the truth was older and quieter. Empires fall, connections endure. In every voice, every story, every child who grew up hearing both sides of the past, America lived again, not as a country of borders, but as a shared belief that no weapon, no lie, and no algorithm could ever outlast the human will to begin again. Under the cold glass of satellite feeds and in the low-lit rooms where analysts once celebrated a slow, patient victory, Russia's master plan to cleave America into 3 pieces had always relied on a simple truth. Nations are held together by stories more than by laws. The strategy was surgical and multi-layered: target the cultural fault lines already visible in the 2030s, amplify local grievances into existential claims, seed authentic voices through networks of bots and proxy influencers, and then grease the machinery of separation with economic and security deals that made secession look not only possible, but preferable. In the South, investments were quietly steered into media outlets, think tanks, and petrotech projects that tied identity to independence. In the Pacific Corridor, clandestine grants and partnerships seeded the language of technological sovereignty and ecological exceptionalism. In the Old Northeast, legal and financial pressure was applied through laundering of narratives that made federal institutions appear obstinate and corrupt. These moves were never blatant invasions. They were slow programming, an array of disinformation, economic nudges, legal confusion, and surrogate diplomacy that turned citizens' memories and everyday grievances into bricks for new borders. By the time independent-minded governors proposed regional charters, the narratives had already hardened into common sense for millions. Separation felt inevitable and even righteous. What made the strategy so dangerous was its realism. It didn't create grievances so much as harvest them and convert them into political infrastructure. The consequence was not merely political fragmentation, but epistemic fragmentation. The same facts meant different things in different zones, so that negotiation became negotiation across different realities rather than different interests. Breaking a campaign like that required a mirror strategy, one that saw through manipulation but refused to mimic its toxicity. The first axis of response was transparency that cut both wide and deep, not the theater of occasional declassifications, but continuous living transparency, where procurement records, foreign partnerships, media funding, and political advertising were open and easily verifiable by citizens. Technology played a dual role. Where Russia used automated networks to hide influence, the defenders built provenance systems that tagged media, traced money, and verified voices with cryptographic timestamps and public ledgers. But tech alone would have been brittle. It needed social scaffolding. Education was retooled not as rote civics, but as immunity training for democracy. Media literacy became a daily practice, students learned to trace information flows, and community exercises normalized the act of disputing while staying connected. Economically, policies stitched interdependence into ordinary life: cross-regional infrastructure projects, shared grids, interoperable healthcare networks, continental research consortia made separation costly on a human scale. Politically, the federation model that emerged favored decentralization plus interlocking institutions, local autonomy married to rotating continental councils, and enforceable norms for cross-border trade and migration, so that discontent could be managed locally without becoming a reason to redraw maps. Most importantly, the strategy weaponized human presence against manufactured narratives. 1,000 truth circles, public archives run by towns and libraries, and civic rituals where people exchanged stories in person created memories that couldn't be rewritten by an AI. These layered measures, technical provenance, civic education, institutional interdependence, and ritualized truth, didn't just rebut lies, they changed the environment in which lies could take hold. Where openness and education created immunity, law and international coordination created teeth. A new legal architecture emerged: swift international tribunals for covert interference, a data accountability tribunal for cross-border digital harms, and treaties that made covert economic entanglements costly and visible. Sanctions were no longer blunt instruments, but targeted legal instruments tied to public hearings and corporate accountability. Platforms, payment processors, and ad networks were compelled to disclose and block coordinated inauthentic behavior. Foreign grants to domestic civic groups required clear provenance and oversight. At the same time, social cohesion programs focused on the horizontal ties that secessionists exploit: shared festivals, exchange residencies for students and workers, joint cultural grants, and labor mobility pacts that turned other into neighbor. Regional compacts reorganized disaster response, healthcare, and food supply so that cooperation became daily habit rather than occasional convenience. When a wildfire smoke darkened 3 skylines at once, the coordinated response was not diplomatic theater, but mutual aid. The rhythms of interdependence eroded the rhetorical force of us versus them. Intelligence agencies adapted, too, moving from pure secrecy to accountable rapid response units that flagged and publicly demonstrated how manipulated narratives spread, giving citizens the evidence to distrust falsehoods. Allies played a role not by lecturing, but by embedding long-term partnerships in climate science, telecom security standards, and joint R&D, helping create shared stakes that made fragmentation unprofitable for ordinary life. Taken together, these legal, economic, social, and diplomatic arms formed a defensive ecology that increased the cost of successful interference and lowered the appeal of separation by making unity the default route for daily survival and prosperity. Finally, and most quietly, the cultural battle was won in the minute practices of care that no foreign intelligence service could fully simulate. Public confessions of past mistakes, governors admitting missteps, media editors publishing corrections with context, corporations opening books on political financing, created a contagious norm of humility that undercut the black and white narratives manipulators relied on. Mental health investments treated the trauma of division as a public good, not an individual failing. Therapy and community healing centers turned fear into language and suspicion into conversation. The Reunited networks institutionalized cross-boundary companionship, apprenticeships, artist residencies, and joint sports leagues that created dozens of personal ties across imagined borders. When Moscow tried a late wave of synthetic manipulation, fabricated referenda, or liberation broadcasts meant to trigger panic, the multi-layered defenses reacted like a living immune system. Provenance trolls exposed false media within hours, legal mechanisms froze the financial conduits, civic educators placed corrective stories in classrooms, and neighbors organized door-to-door verification drives to rebuild trust in person. Over time, the cost-benefit calculus shifted. Secessionist narratives became harder to sustain, not because of one policy, but because everyday life had been redesigned to reward cooperation and punish clandestine division. In the end, the story America told itself mattered more than any law or server. A shared narrative that recognized past harms, taught citizens how to recognize manipulation, and normalized collaborative governance made the continent resilient. Russia's campaign had been clever and patient, but it had underestimated the stubbornness of human ties when institutions, technology, law, and culture were all deliberately reoriented to protect them. The result was not a simple return to the old map, but a new political reality where the idea of splitting the country into 3 lasting, functional states became a brittle option against a web of mutual dependencies and public practices designed to keep a plural, contested, but undivided polity alive. A strong, sustained friendship between the United States and India is not just diplomatic window dressing. It is a strategic engine that can reshape America's economic strength, technological leadership, and global influence for decades to come. Economically, close ties with India expand markets for American goods and services, while diversifying supply chains in ways that increase resilience. Joint investments and streamlined regulatory cooperation mean U.S. manufacturers can rely on alternative, high-quality suppliers for critical components, reducing dependence on single points of failure and lowering the risk that geopolitical shocks will stop industries cold. India's rapidly growing middle class represents one of the largest consumer markets on Earth. American firms that partner early in technology, healthcare, education, agriculture, and clean energy stand to gain long-term growth in job creation at home. Technologically, India is a rising powerhouse of software talent, research institutions, and startups. Collaboration on semiconductors, AI, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing accelerates innovation for both countries. Joint R&D programs, shared standards, and cross-border data partnerships help the U.S. stay at the cutting edge while embedding ethical norms and interoperable frameworks that shape global tech governance in democratic directions. On security, a deep partnership with India strengthens regional stability across the Indo-Pacific and beyond. Shared intelligence, joint exercises, and coordinated maritime patrols increase deterrence against coercive actors and secure critical sea lanes and trade routes. For the U.S., this means a reduced burden on unilateral power projection and a stronger network of like-minded partners to uphold international law. Energy and climate cooperation are another major dividend. India's urgent need to balance development with emissions reductions creates a vast arena for American cleantech exports, joint deployment of renewables, grid modernization projects, and collaborative climate finance mechanisms. Those initiatives not only accelerate global decarbonization, but create American jobs designing, manufacturing, and servicing the next generation of sustainable infrastructure. Culturally and socially, the Indian diaspora in America is a bridge of people, ideas, and entrepreneurship. Indian Americans are among the most highly educated and economically productive immigrant communities. Their success strengthens local economies, enriches research and academic institutions, and fosters bilateral person-to-person ties that make cooperation durable even when politics are turbulent. Education and people-to-people exchanges, more scholarships, faculty links, student mobility, and joint cultural programs cultivate mutual understanding and produce the bilingual, bicultural leaders who will manage tomorrow's partnerships. In global institutions, a close U.S.-India relationship amplifies democratic values. Working together at the United Nations, WTO, and in multilateral coalitions, the two countries can push for transparent trade rules, responsible use of technology, and coordinated responses to crises like pandemics or cyber attacks. Economically targeted sanctions, export controls, or supply chain adjustments are far more credible when backed by broad coalitions rather than unilateral moves, and India's cooperation can tip contested votes and norms towards outcomes that favor stability and openness. Finally, the intangible but vital payoff, credibility. America that sustains a deep, pragmatic, and respectful partnership with India demonstrates that democracies can build strategic, mutually beneficial ties without coercion or domination. That example attracts other partners and helps create a world in which alliances are based on shared capacity and shared values, not fear. For the United States, the prize of being India's close partner is not only immediate gains in trade and security, it is a re-anchoring of American power in a multipolar world where cooperation, innovation, and human capital, not isolation, determine long-term strength.
If you liked this video, please hit the like button, share it with friends who care about the future, and subscribe for more deep dives.